This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Say hello to Alexa Plus and see how Alexa can do more for you. Need tickets to that last-minute show? Craving your favorite restaurant? Sit back, relax, and talk naturally. Alexa's on it. Alexa learns your preferences to create a personalized experience. And now, Alexa Plus is free with Prime on your Amazon devices, like Echo and Fire TV. Learn more at amazon.com/Alexa Plus.
Adobe Acrobat Studio, your team's home base. Collaborate within a shared PDF space. You've got your docs, your plans, your specs, and then invite the crew to build what's next. They talk up the teamwork. Here's an updated render. They think that this design could be a contender. And when somebody wonders what's the next step, AI helps you finish the rest. Bolts are tight, now your plan's refined. Run a smoother business when you're all aligned. Do that with Acrobat. Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Oklahoma Christian University political scientist Trey Orndorff. Hey, Trey.
Mike, it's great to be back with you in the midweek show.
Yeah, I am looking forward to getting to some of those things we didn't quite have time for in our regular weekend show. And one thing, we talked a little bit on the weekend show about the Defense Production Act in the context of Anthropic. But, I'm kind of out of practice thinking about the Defense Production Act. We talked about it a lot in the context of COVID when it was invoked. But actually, President Trump recently invoked it to compel domestic production of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup weed killer. Also, it applied to elemental phosphorus, which is a precursor chemical for glyphosate. And this order came out the day after Bayer, which is the only domestic producer of glyphosate, though it's actually not a U.S. company, they proposed a $7.25 billion settlement to resolve their glyphosate-based cancer lawsuits. And also the Supreme Court in April is set to hear arguments on whether federal law actually blocks those lawsuits entirely. Now, a lot of the MAHA people, Make America Healthy Again, they were not too happy about this executive order. In fact, key MAHA figures called it things like a betrayal, a love letter to the chemical industry, a grenade thrown at the voters who made Trump's 2024 win possible, And during your confirmation hearings, when Surgeon General nominee Casey Means was being asked about this, she said, well, wait a second. Or they said, wait a second. You've called glyphosate a carcinogen, and now the president issues an executive order boosting its production. Well, she kind of walked a careful line here. She said farmers are trapped in what she called an impossible situation because our agriculture system is dependent on these toxic chemicals. And so she wasn't going to say, well, it was a horrible executive order. And meanwhile, there's this bipartisan group of lawmakers led by Republican Thomas Massie, a Democrat Shelley Pingree, as well as on this Lauren Boebert and Ro Khanna, so it is bipartisan. They introduced a bill to block the order and preserve the right to sue over glyphosate claims. So, Trey, before we get into the politics of this, I thought we could talk about the policy implications. I'm wondering if you think, as a matter of policy, President Trump's move to protect the only domestic manufacturer of Roundup was the right thing to do.
This is actually, I think, more complicated than most listeners might imagine, because on the one hand, there is, in fact, some credible evidence that there is cancer downstream usage, and that's a problem, right? And I think that has to get litigated. On the other side, you're not going to hear this often, but Means is not exactly wrong in her walking of that fine line. If you banned the use of these kinds of things today, you want to talk about food prices changing. Friends, food prices would change dramatically. Now, I recognize that those two statements are in tension, but as a policy matter, that's, I think, where some of our hardest and most thoughtful policy has to come, where we're dealing with either transitional periods or we have these kind of clear cost-benefit analyses that we're trying to overcome, which is, okay, do we want to have chemicals? Some kind of chemicals are, in fact, harmful. What's the counterweight of, but do we want to have food for everybody to eat? And we have to balance those. So I'll give her a little bit of credit. I thought that was actually one of her better answers compared to many of the things that she was arguing with. But what do you think about that?
I'm so torn on Maha because there are parts of it that I so agree with. I think
Agreed, yeah.
you're focusing on eating real food and exercise and all of these things I think are great. But then there's that kind of like tinfoil hat kind of, well, don't have any kind of vaccines. And, oh, by the way, toxins, everything's a frickin' toxin, And when you actually look at the scientific evidence around glyphosate, most of it suggests it's actually not a likely carcinogen when used when you get it at typical exposure levels. And that's not just the US EPA concluded that. It's the European Food Safety Authority, the European Chemicals Agency, and Health Canada. Now, some reports have said, well, wait a second, the WHO, their International Agency for Research on Cancer, says glyphosate is probably carcinogenic to humans. So, okay, but by the way, in that same sort of probably carcinogenic to humans category that this agency, they also include red meat, night shift work, and I kid you not, very hot beverages. So, it's one thing to say, yeah, if you take a whole ton of this stuff in a really dumb way, it might give you cancer, as opposed to, as long as you're not a nut about this stuff. So as long as you're not drinking, shots of Roundup or something like that, there's probably some other issues with that, you're probably going to be okay. Well, and so that's why I think we're too quick, oftentimes, some people in the Maha movement to say, well, it's a chemical. Well, it's got to be bad for you. Well,
That's such a good point. Is it natural, or is another terrible term that gets thrown around in policymaking. Friends, let us explore what it means for something to be natural for a second, and if you'd really want that or not. I think the more serious potential claim here, and you're right there, you got to be careful about that potentially carcinogenic. Some of the lawsuits against is because of those who are trying to apply it and use it, and as a result, your exposure can be different in those circumstances. And there can be issues there. And I want to be clear, that's what I think the real policy is around, not your kid getting cancer because of Roundup, right?
Good point.
And you're right to point that out, because that is a bit of you put it, the tinfoil hat of the Maha movement, which is to suggest that those kinds of things happen. So, yeah. And this is a little near and dear to my heart, too. As a matter of fact, one of our faculty members here, she is blind. And I can't tell you how often, as somebody who's chronically ill and she is blind, we'll have individuals be like, well, did you know if you only used fill in the blank, woohoo stuff, you too can heal your butt and or your eyes. And that, it seems like I'm being sarcastic, but we were together in office. We had just been kind of teasing about that because they come in, and we had this mom come by who for this professor in particular, was like, did you know if you use concentrated carrot juice, you can cure blindness? And, what's your response to that other than to go, thank you? But I hear you, that's here. But I think that's the more realistic policy. And I think that's why you see like the bipartisan bill coming from Massey. It's not about the kid getting cancer. It's about what's happening to the people on these farms who are actually using it and probably getting higher doses.
Fair point.
Yeah.
I think, and the reason to invoke the DPA is not because there's some kind of real threat to the supply. It's the liability shield that comes into play. And the reason you have a liability shield, it makes sense. If the government is forcing you to provide something, well, you shouldn't be liable for providing the thing that you're being forced to provide. And so now that doesn't apply retroactively. So that means current lawsuits can still proceed, although the Supreme Court might end up deciding that, and when they hear the case, that federal law actually preempts these state lawsuits. The basic argument here is that, well, the EPA approved it, didn't say it was a potential carcinogen, so therefore the states can't say otherwise or have laws that would allow lawsuits, and that's another issue. And Bayer has said, well, maybe we're just going to pull out of the U.S. market entirely. I think that was just, but I understand they're concerned about their legal liability and that sort of thing. But to me, if you want to talk about glyphosate and national security risks, well, the real national security risk then is that 99% of it, I kid you not, 99% of it is sourced from China. And so, the U.S. used to produce it domestically, but it just was cheaper to do in China because, by the way, like producing a lot of chemicals, it's messy and environmentally not so great. And as you might have heard, China's environmental and worker safety regulations, not quite as good as we have here in the U.S.
Well, the other slight item here, because we were framing it in terms of MAHA and health, but keep in mind, phosphorus, it's also a key component in some kinds of munitions, semiconductors, lithium-ion batteries. So when you say, hey, China's producing 99% of it, we're not just talking about Roundup. And so those are larger implications here about this particular chemical, I think, that's worth at least being aware of.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with the position of Means as well as with RFK Jr., which is, again, I never thought I'd say that, right? But if there are, it's not crazy to say there might be health concerns. I'm certainly willing to consider that. I believe there's a new EPA review of glyphosate coming up in, I want to say sometime later this year, maybe. But if you just ban it, the U.S. food system, well, like I said, food prices spike, and that actually ends up hurting at-risk and low-income people the most. And so you're right, you have to kind of balance these sort of things. And so it is a complex issue. I think less complex maybe are some of the other issues that she was grilled on at the hearing. I'm a little uncomfortable about her as a surgeon. Not that Surgeon General is that big of a deal. It's not like they have this kind of independent authority to do much of anything. But I wanted to get your take. I mean, you've dealt with the medical system and heard all kinds of crazy crackpot theories just because you're immunocompromised and had issues for years, and you're also, closer to this kind of stuff than I am. What do you take away from her potentially being the next Surgeon General, if they're the
It deeply bothers me that she doesn't have her active license, right? Is that the end of the world? Please, listeners, don't think that but however, there's a reason that she didn't get it. It's not even to be a nurse, just to touch people. You are supposed to come. We can come talk about this. You're talking about somewhere in the vicinity of 60 to 80 hours of additional active training per year, in addition to some testing to keep your license active. And there's good reasons for that. It's because you need to be up to date on what's going on before you're putting your hands on real human beings in a hospital or other kind of settings. And so you're right, Mike. It's not as if this is huge, but it sets a really bad kind of ongoing precedent that we've gotten. And this has been the problem that I've had with RFK Jr. as well. Like we talked about it a minute ago. There are some things about MAHA that I can be sympathetic towards, that I might even overlap with. But this underlying assumption that comes from everybody we're putting in these positions of power that suggest that medical doctors and the adjacent workers for them are keeping health cures from you and or poisoning you in a variety of ways is so antithetical to the kinds of policies that we need to have. And it bothers me deeply that we're just continuing to dig that hole with her. So for example, that's a problem. Or again, I don't care if somebody wants to use psychedelic mushrooms. I'm a libertarian. Take all the mushrooms that you want. That's fine. Go for it. But if you're going to pretend that we have evidence for that, but we don't have evidence for, vaccine, like a variety of different vaccine ingredients, that's where I start having some deep problems. And that's where, again, that's where we start getting into the tinfoil hat version. And not just for her personally, but for everybody as that becomes policy.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. I guess one of my concerns is, while I haven't had the sort of health challenges you have, I have had issues from time to time. And it's really easy nowadays, especially, to go down the sort of health influencer rabbit hole, especially if traditional things haven't worked or aren't working the way you hope they will. And there's so much very slick-looking marketing and testimonials and stuff. And even someone like me, someone like you, I would assume, who's, trained to kind of spot problems with arguments and look for sources. When you're sick and you're not feeling good, a certain desperation kind of put you in a position where you're not able to make the best decisions. And I feel like there are plenty of people who are just completely taking advantage of folks in this position. And that's my concern about the kind of crazy influencer part of health influencer part of the MAHA movement, I guess, more than anything else.
Yes. One of the things that I did that tried to, again, this seems weird, but it's true, that I tried to have some control and feel better was I tried to basically do literature reviews over the topics that were affecting me, looking at the best literature that we have available. And I have access to some things more than others do because I'm at a university. But even aside that, you can go down that hole, and that gives you some control. But you're right. The problem is there are edges to the things that we know in a meaningful way. And so, for example, in my particular health condition, there's no cure, there's no fix, there's management. And would I love for there to be a cure? Do I have little hits when the different kind of research comes up? And there's some things down the pipeline, 5-10 years out where they're not cures, but even maybe better Band-Aids might be a way to put it. But you're not wrong. And she has definitively fallen into the category of the slick, I'm going to fix you in her personal life. And that's a problem for the person who's supposed to be the top doctor for the country. That's a problem because, as you rightfully note, there aren't always going to be easy fixes to that. And one of the most important things you're going to get from your doctor is going to sometimes be that hard answer of, there's nothing medically that I can further do. Here's how we manage. And that's a tough conversation, but it's more honest than the, hey, take a psychedelic mushroom and you're going to feel better or be cured. Or, yeah.
But, and I guess as a libertarian, I assume you have a certain sympathy for that view of, well, especially say on something like vaccines. Well, okay, the argument that should be a decision between a physician and the parents. Well, okay, but there's also that, what I'll call the community protection view, right, of pushing more vaccines. I mean, like right now there are, I believe, 11 vaccines on the routine schedule. That's 6 fewer than before RFK Jr. became HHS secretary. And you might say, well, that's not a big deal. But, and even though, plenty of like the MMR vaccine is still on there, but the problem then becomes this general view when you hear people at the very top of the chain saying like, hey, vaccines, kind of sketchy. And so what we have, 2025, the largest number of measles cases since 1991, over 2,000. And oh, by the way, we're not through February yet, and we already have 982 this year. So we're almost certainly going to shatter that. And that's what happens when all of a sudden just a few percent fewer folks become vaccinated. And there's that so what argument that, well, people don't want to be vaccinated, let them run the risk. Because after all, say the measles vaccine, for instance, 97% effective. But of course, that means that 3% of the people who are vaccinated and it didn't work are being put at risk. And then there are also costs to treating those measles outbreaks that will be in part borne by the system, not just by those affected individuals. So it's not like it's a pure liberty kind of thing. We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters-exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
LifeLock, how can I help?
The IRS said I filed my return,
but I haven't.
1 in 4 tax-paying Americans has paid the price of identity fraud.
What do I do?
My refund, though.
I'm freaking out.
Don't worry, I can fix this.
LifeLock fixes identity theft guaranteed and gets your money back with up to $3 million in coverage.
I'm so relieved.
No problem. I'll be with you every step of the way.
1 in 4 was a fraud-paying American. Not anymore. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.